The 51st G7 summit is underway in Canada, with world leaders meeting amid rising tensions from conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, trade disputes, U.S. tariffs, and proposals to reintegrate Russia and China add to the complexity. Over the next 2 days, the leaders will focus on migration and critical minerals. For more on South Africa's role in the summit, we speak to Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who is the CEO of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Elizabeth, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. It seems as though that every time, at least for the past 3 years or so, there is meetings of this nature, whether we speak about the G7 or the G20 for that matter, that you find that what is at the center of discussion or what dominates discussions are the conflicts, the geopolitical tension that is playing out. Is this now starting to shape what we see coming out of these summits? And also, how does this inform the crux, which is trade?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, and it's unavoidable, I think, when leaders of countries meet and there is a conflagration or a huge conflict that has just begun, that inevitably this will be the focus, and we've seen that across the board, not just in the last couple of years, but indeed whenever there's been an outbreak, in particularly in the Middle East, it tends to take priority. So clearly, sort of 4 or 5 days ago, after these Israeli bombing, this is going to dominate. I see this morning that they've also issued a very brief statement on what's happening between Israel and Iran, where they've emphasized that they believe Israel has a right to defend itself, to its own security, and that Iran should not have access to nuclear weapons. Clearly, the G7 is a group where on these issues, you will probably have greater coherence than you would have at the G20. But of course, what happens is that the primary purpose, which was really to discuss other bigger long-term issues, like of course global economic stability, first and foremost, but also other areas you've already touched on. Critical minerals, artificial intelligence tend to then get less bandwidth, have less bandwidth than what is the most pressing issue, the most urgent issue, which of course is the escalation of tensions in the Middle East.
Yeah, the trade tariffs was part of the discussions, we understand, or would have been part of the discussions on the agenda. But now with the Donald Trump cutting short his time at the G7, what does this then all mean? Because at least here you're able to get all these leaders together to come and have a conversation. Also the impact around the decisions, executive orders that have been taken by Donald Trump and the impact that is having on world trade.
Well, from what I understand from the reports this morning, there was some sort of agreement arrived at between the UK and the US, and that Prime Minister Carney, specifically with regard now to the bilaterals, has indicated that they feel confident, that they hope that they'll be able to come to some sort of economic and security agreement with the US over the course of the next month. President Trump has apparently said that tariffs are very much part of that agreement. The Canadians don't agree, but invariably the discussions around trade, as far as the American administration is concerned, would be taking place bilaterally anyway. It's an opportunity, the fact that all the leaders, the G7 leaders, are around the table, and he has taken issue on tariffs with all of them and beyond, that this is an ideal opportunity really to tackle them. But they were going to be bilateral anyway. They're not necessarily going to happen in the full plenary. And we know that it was unlikely that there was going to be an agreement on a joint statement in that regard. And in fact, the Canadians already sort of preempted that by saying that They're not planning to issue a leaders' declaration, a joint communique at the end of the summit. Rather, they will issue specific brief statements on particular issues or themes that they have discussed over the course of the last 6 months, rather than trying to get agreement on a statement. We had a similar situation in 2018. When Canada again chaired the G7, and President Trump left early to meet the leader of North Korea in Singapore, and again there, he left early and had instructed his officials not to sign on to the declaration. It's also something that I think we'll be facing as the G20 chair at the end of the year, in terms of the extent to which we'll be able to get consensus on a document and have the US sign on to it. It's a very different set of dynamics that are playing out in the G7 and the G20 because of the disruptive element that Mr. Trump has brought to all of these discussions. And of course, trade and tariffs are front and center.
Yeah, and still sticking with Donald Trump cutting short his trip to Canada, is with the bilaterals once again. Last week we heard from President Cyril Ramaphosa that there is an intention to meet Donald Trump on the sidelines of the summit. Not too sure once again if that meeting did take place, or if there's still an opportunity for that meeting to take place. But what does it mean if the president leaves the G7 summit without having had that conversation with Donald Trump?
Well, I think there were a number of conversations that were intended to take place with Donald Trump on the sidelines, particularly today, which is also supposed to be the outreach meeting with the invited guests, which include South Africa, India, Brazil, Ukraine, Mexico, and I think Australia and South Korea. I mean, a lost opportunity to have a face-to-face discussion is always an issue, particularly when you have when you have a rather difficult relationship, and where I think there were a couple of issues that the president would want to take up again with President Trump. Of course, the G20 is one, but the broader US-South Africa relationship is another. I think President Zelensky will feel the same in terms of the fact that he won't be able to have a face-to-face with President Trump today. And indeed, it was also scheduled, I think, for the Mexican president. All of these countries have had rather difficult relations with the US administration, and having the face-to-face talks in private is always an opportunity that one should try to take on. But it is what it is, and we'll have to look at other avenues and other opportunities for such conversations.
Yeah, and just finally, what else is it that we should be looking out for from the G7 summit?
I think, given that they will be issuing short statements, and I understand one of them will be around critical minerals, another one around migration, perhaps another one around artificial intelligence. It is really to see what they're saying on those issues. These are all important issues also for South Africa and Africa, and indeed a couple of them are on the agenda of our G20 presidency on critical minerals. Our priority as South Africa in that debate is really to focus on how critical minerals can be used to industrialize, to beneficiate, to move us up the value chains. The concerns in the G7 around critical minerals is really securing critical minerals supply chains, because this has now become such a hot geopolitical issue and is very much part of the trade war between the US and China. It's an issue that has clearly been on the European Union agenda as well, in terms of concerns that they have around that. So a slightly different perspective on what the discussion around critical minerals would be. And clearly also, let's see what comes out on artificial intelligence, which is really one of the big global governance elephants in the room as we move forward.
Yeah, and if Donald Trump doesn't sign the draft on critical minerals, what does it mean?
Well, I mean, one can argue, if he signs, does it mean anything? He might change his mind. So.
Thank you so much for making time for us this morning, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. She's the CEO of the South African Institute for International Affairs.